Hello, and welcome to In Pursuit of Clarity, episode number 44, entitled Reorientation. I think it goes without saying that the present state of the world is far from ideal, and in so many ways has been spiraling further and further downward and away from this ideal in recent years. I wanted to use this episode as a vehicle to discuss concrete and clearly defined examples of where I feel we've most lost the plot, and attempt to posit equally concrete and clearly defined examples of what I think would be the healthier course by contrast. Learning to discern, again, to make confident value judgments, to allow us to embrace the good and reject the bad, is such a crucial step in extricating ourselves from this mess. So, for what it's worth, I'll share some of my own value judgments. I'll assign each topic or section with a number for ease of reference, and if you'd like me to elaborate or further explain any one of them, or perhaps devote an entire cast or an entire video to any specific one, feel free to let me know. Similarly, if you just have a comment or even a disagreement, please feel equally free. And before we begin, I think it's easy for something like this to come off in a know-it-all or sermonizing fashion, but I hope it doesn't. These are simply my own opinions, and a collection of things I think it most valuable or potentially helpful to voice at this moment in time. The format or framing I'll be using is that I'd like to see us gravitate from X to Y. For example, to simply jump right into the first topic, I'd like to see us move from irreverence to reverence, broadly speaking, and this one requires explanation. As so much of what we consume on a daily basis becomes increasingly cheap or superficial, or manipulative and dishonest, or pretentious and self-important, it's easier than ever to fall into a mental state of mocking and deriding everything. Our world is indeed becoming, in the parlance of our age, fake and gay. Our emotions are flippantly played upon to sell products or ideas or political candidates. Television and movies and all varieties of media content are increasingly geared towards the same. It's incredibly difficult to, at a glance, find anything worthy of deep feeling, whether these feelings are love or respect or admiration. But this is a disaster. It's this depth of feeling that motivates us, that moves us and drives us. It's the fundamental fuel and energy behind our existence. If we lose this, we lose our will to fight, often our desire to even exist. So many people find themselves in this state of mind and this state of being. The why is understandable, but we need to recognize that this is ultimately a cancerous and supremely unhealthy state of mind. So much so that it might be said that a primary goal of life is to overcome it. Those who revere nothing, those types for whom nothing is sacred, have essentially lost their spark and their fire. Life becomes a dreary, tiresome, hopeless, and unrewarding burden. I'm reminded of the quote, "He who has a why to live for can bear almost any how." When we revere something, hold something sacred, or love something dearly and deeply, this gifts us a reason for being. When we're in a mode of permanent, irreverent mockery of all existence, we strip ourselves of those reasons for being, and we cheapen our very existence, and threaten to spread this cheapness as contagion. Focus on what you love. Actively search out things worthy of your love, whether this be your family or your children or your partner or your people or culture or nation, your conception of God, a vision of the future. Whatever it is, learn to revere again. And most importantly, recognize the importance of the concept and the act of reverence, and its integral role as fuel and energy making the world go round. I'm tempted to go on this topic, but because I'd like to get to multiple themes in this cast, I'll try to keep these shorter, and we'll move to number 2. I'd like to see us move from the unnatural back to the natural in all respects. Natural can be a slightly tricky term to define, but it's not as tricky as some make it out to be. To start with a clear example to better illustrate the broader point, let's consider the food and drink we take in on a daily basis. Our bodies are innately and biologically programmed and have become attuned to taking in certain forms of nourishment. And I don't think any reasonable person would disagree that some of these forms of nourishment are a bigger net positive than others. A glass of fresh spring water is superior to sugar-filled or aspartame-laden soda, an apple or an egg superior to a preservative-laden Twinkie or donut. Sodas and Twinkies and donuts, as immediately gratifying as they are, aren't found in nature, of course. We don't have many thousands of years of our bodies being oriented to process them efficiently. The same could be said for the fluoride in our water, the vast majority of preservatives in our food, the lead still existing in so much of our paint and the cheap Chinese products flooding our markets, vaccines we inject into our bloodstream, even the strong electromagnetic frequencies emitted from phones, routers, microwaves, 5G towers. We're experiencing massive spikes in conditions like cancer or rates of autism, and a slew of new mystery ailments for these very reasons. Amazingly, despite our vaunted technology and medical care, life expectancy is now dropping, and all of this is a leading reason. We could extend this theory of embracing the natural and time-tested still further, and include, for example, the pairing between a male and a female, a pairing capable of producing offspring, thus making it not only natural, but an absolutely vital ingredient of the natural order. This male and female pairing also provides resulting offspring with a clear and ever-present example of masculine and feminine archetypes, an invaluable lesson and orientating force in early life. The more we embrace the natural, the traditional and time-tested, the more sure and robust and sturdy is the foundation beneath our feet, and the less chaotic and confusing life becomes. Just as natural and healthy foods nourish the body and provide strength and energy, ideas and behaviors and mindsets can do the same for our minds and our souls. Those who live in tiny apartments in concrete jungles, eating lab-grown meat substitutes or bug slurry, living with cats or same-sex partners, and filling their heads with modern entertainment, are living the epitome of an unnatural existence. The immediate gratification upside is clear to them, but they rarely seem to consider the significant longer-term and broader picture costs. And they are truly significant. It's no coincidence that mental disorder is far higher among this demographic than any other. And I don't say this with any glee or schadenfreude, but this collective decline into madness has only just begun. We've only seen the tip of this iceberg. There will be so much more to come, barring some miracle. And in my opinion, the problems will increase exponentially because of the contagious and cumulative effects. Flee from this bad air, back into the fresh air of nature and the natural, in every sense of that word. And on to number 3. I'd like to see us gravitate from unconditional tolerance to a more mature, proactive judgment and discernment. A recognition that tolerance is most certainly not the net positive the modern world has tried so hard to portray it as. The more one tolerates extremely negative or unhealthy behaviors, the more they'll get as a result. This is true on the individual level, with regard to our own standards for ourselves, and the group level, with regard to nations and states and cultures. One of the most important tasks we have as human beings is to discern between white and black, light and dark, and draw that dividing line accordingly, embracing the former and rejecting the latter. This doesn't necessitate injustice or mistreatment, even rudeness or incivility. There are ways to separate ourselves from all of this without jackboots on the throats of degenerates. In fact, in my view, the only lasting solution is to avoid the jackboots and the tyrannical approach. What we're dealing with is a mind virus, and a subset of the population that has been so thoroughly manipulated, indoctrinated, and essentially brainwashed, not just with a big lie, but with layers upon layers of lies, that the only way for most of these to see the light is to truly live their philosophy and ideology, perhaps even to its unconstrained fullest, and to its natural, inevitable ends. This is why I so strongly advocate the concept of separation, even balkanization or a national divorce. They've made their bed, and they need to be allowed to lie in it and see where it gets them. More importantly, we need to be allowed to live in a manner of our choosing, and the type of environment we could create if we were somehow able to erect high walls, metaphorically speaking, though perhaps literally too, and keep these poisons outside of them, the future we might experience as a result, the potential here, is incredible. To manifest this, it starts with the personal and immediate. It starts with us as individuals, first and foremost learning to hone our instinct and ability to actively discern, actively sort and sift the healthy from the unhealthy, the fruitful from the fruitless, the fundamentally meaningful and net positive from the meaningless and illusory. It may feel like a waste of time and energy cultivating and developing this individual and intuitive sense of discernment, considering so many of us feel relatively powerless to make changes in our environment accordingly. But the changes will come, and the first step in this process is the personal development and honing of these judgment skills. On to number 4. I'd like to see us move from a mindset of taking to one of giving. A conscious attempt to remove all instincts toward parasitism or exploitation from our minds, and a recognition of the power of giving and gratitude. This always risks sounding like vague, hippie, new age type of fluff, but it's so important that we remove that stigma and learn to recognize the overwhelming value here. This mindset isn't simply invaluable to the community or tribe as a whole, but even more so to the individual responsible for the giving. It can certainly be counterintuitive, entertaining the concept that we gain more from giving than we do from receiving. But broadly speaking, it's a simple, unequivocal truth. When we actively help another person, specifically one we resonate with or love or care about, we're often rewarded with a lasting sense of purpose and fulfillment that can't be found through other avenues. There is power in giving, and in fact, by its very nature, it's a powerful act and role. To give historical examples, this was a main role of kings and chieftains and leaders in the Indo-European and Western tradition, holding feasts and banquets, for example, granting gifts to the most courageous men willing to rally to their banner. The mark of a great and powerful man was, to a large degree, his ability to give and gift, and this was an integral part of the culture. This instinct toward hoarding and piling up riches is a very modern one, and very much of a different and distinct culture. Of course, we all recognize the downside to being indiscriminate in the realm of kindness or giving and gifting. So when one has time, energy, resources, or gifts of any sort to give, I strongly believe they should aim this generous instinct wisely, now more than ever, considering that we no longer tend to live in close-knit communities surrounded by kith and kin. But this is another topic for another time. The substantive point here is that seeking to be a creator, producer, or giver, as opposed to that type always looking for some edge to maximize their personal gain, is a key ingredient in lasting personal happiness, fulfillment, and in someday creating those more ideal communities. And number 5. On the individual level, I'd like to see us work to eliminate the desire for external validation. and move toward the development of internal solidity and self-sufficiency. And by this, I'm not referring to the physical self-sufficiency of the survivalist, for example, who procures his own food and other resources, but rather the philosophical and spiritual version of this. For those unfamiliar with the Asch conformity experiments, and those like them, it's been definitively proven that most people are willing to suspend personal judgment and critical thinking when presented with the perception that a majority of people disagreed with them. Subjects were presented with a visual representation of a vertical line, and then presented with 3 multiple-choice options of differently sized vertical lines, and tasked with choosing the one of these 3 options that was the same length as the initial vertical line they were shown. 99% answered correctly, initially and in isolation, but when several actors were hired to all give the same wrong answer, a significant percentage of the test subjects then switched their own answer. Only 25% were willing to consistently defy the perceived majority and stick with their initial, correct response. There's so much to be said and unpacked here, but to attempt to keep things concise, most people are, by nature, insecure and seek validation in an over-socialized way. This mindset can cause people to be coaxed into doing or saying nearly anything, no matter how outlandish. And this includes holding political or philosophical positions that are immensely destructive. In this age of tech and social media dominance, it's become incredibly easy for powerful parties to present illusory pictures as to how the majority of the public thinks and feels, which engages this conformist instinct and causes otherwise rational and logical people to embrace the most negative and counterproductive positions. And even more important than the merely political implications, one can't be spiritually healthy and well-oriented until they discover and learn to draw from their own inner wellspring, a wellspring that ultimately flows from a higher source. Of course, this is easier said than done, and there's no short paragraph anyone might pen to help teach mastery on this front. But it'd be difficult to exaggerate the importance of this as a goal. It changes everything, allows one to have a deeply rooted and unshakable sense of confidence, to never again be easily tossed to and fro in the winds of fickle and weaponized popular culture or peer group influence, and at its best is a constant source of energy and inspiration. Again, much like a permanent source of pure, fresh spring water, inexhaustible nourishment that doesn't need to be sought externally. Self-mastery, in this regard, is essentially synonymous with a relationship with God, a decimation of the personal demons and addictions and petty and base desires that so easily and effectively lead us astray, replaced by a clear-sighted focus on all that's loftier and vastly more important. This doesn't mean having no use for people. There's a great deal of beauty and immense value in being able to communicate with the higher natures of good people. It simply means putting in the hard work to avoid being needy in any respect, to avoid the validation of others being a mandatory prerequisite of your happiness or well-being, and subsequently risking falling to pieces when this validation fails to materialize, which is, increasingly, the natural state of most people in our age. It's not merely unhealthy in the highest sense of that word, but it's also a leading cause of the absolutely absurd politics and life philosophies some have come to embrace. Eternally needy people are effortlessly herded into following perceived societal convention. Don't be needy, especially as a man. It repels the opposite sex, diminishes respect among your own sex, and will inevitably cause you to forever stumble down subpar paths. Learn to provide for your own deepest needs, and one can just as effortlessly break this cycle. And number 6. I'd like to see us flee from the ugly and toward an embrace of the beautiful in all spheres. At first, this may sound strange on its face, and a reasonably well-adjusted person might ask, doesn't everyone naturally seek to do this? I'm afraid the answer to that question is a definitive no, and becoming ever more so. I've shared that quote I so love from a work of that unique genius I so appreciate, Dostoevsky, saying, "Beauty will save the world," and I think it's easy to misunderstand this. Beauty should be understood in its broadest sense here, not merely surface-level aesthetic appeal. Words can be beautiful, thoughts or ideas or conceptions can be beautiful, gestures or mannerisms or facial expressions, or one's physical comportment or bearing. We can work to maximize the beauty of our own internal nature, just as we can work to beautify our external surroundings. And both matter. For those that haven't yet made this connection, ugliness is something of a tool and a weapon, whether consciously or unconsciously wielded. There's a large and growing culture that embraces and seeks to magnify and spread ugliness. Modern art and architecture is an example of this, but so are our fellow human beings all too often. The impetus in young women to cut off long and beautiful hair, or to flippantly cover the body with piercings and insignificant tattoos, the cheering and championing of the overweight, the unfit, and the generally unwell. All of this is part and parcel of the same archetypal rebellion against health and natural beauty, and in fact one might argue the urge to become the physical manifestation of its opposite. In my opinion, one of the most significant and important tasks we have as human beings is to learn to discern, as effectively as is possible, the beautiful from the ugly, in this broadest and most all-encompassing sense. And by doing so, we're able to intuitively glimpse the hand of the divine and sense echoes of the Creator and His perfect, ultimate nature. We are also able to learn to love again and see reasons to love in an increasingly fallen and ugly world, and reason to fight to improve things. Beauty inspires, uplifts, energizes, yet can simultaneously comfort and put one at peaceful and serene ease. Consciously seeking out the beautiful and consciously learning to sidestep and banish its opposite allows us to improve virtually every facet of not only our own lives, but those around us. It's no coincidence that great poets and writers and artists would, almost without exception, seek out beautiful environments and settings in their attempt to cultivate beautiful states of mind, allowing them to connect with higher realms and call down, as it were, inspired genius. And because it's contagious, by using this inspired genius to produce great works, they, in turn, serve to beautify others, in a sense. It's difficult to think of a better gift to the world. Recognize and propagate all things beautiful. Seek to manifest the divine, insofar as we're capable, in the physical realm. The universe will thank you for this service. And number 7. This one is an extremely tall order at this moment in time, but I tend to think this only makes it all the more important. I'd like to see us do all we can to banish bitterness and anger, and find ways and reasons to embrace gratitude and optimism. I think many of us look at the state of the world and not only feel intense anger, but take on the notion that our goal should even perhaps be to stoke and increase this anger, because real change won't occur until it reaches critical mass. On some level, this is logical and rational. But I feel it so often misses a key point, which is there are two separate crowds being dealt with here. There are the naive, oblivious, unaware, or uncaring, who do indeed need a shock to the system in order to be pushed into doing anything at all, anything other than mindlessly going with the flow. And then there's that group that actively thinks about the how and why behind the hellish chaos we're facing, who largely knows the score, at least broadly speaking, and feels a profound sense of injustice and righteous indignation. The former group might benefit from additional anger or motivating emotion, but this second group can end up suffering in very real ways from its excess. Not just an excess of anger or bitterness, but the hopelessness and nihilism this often ushers in through the same door. One can simply come to hate the world, and embrace a dark and hateful mindset toward all existence accordingly. In other words, those in this second group already have sufficient motivating anger. They clearly recognize the net negatives we're wrestling against. What they often need, more than anything, is a clear example of all of the net positives worth fighting for, a vision of just how beautiful the world might be if we can find some way to untangle this chaos and get our house in order. In number 4, we discussed the deeply positive effects of giving as opposed to taking. Something very similar applies to gratitude. When we're able to clearly recognize the upsides in our lives and keep them ever present in mind, we're not only happier and psychologically and spiritually healthier as a result, but we're then able to navigate existence far more efficiently, to better maximize the positive elements and minimize the negative, and to have far more energy to do so. Never forget, there are indeed thousands of reasons to feel bitterness or anger at any given moment. Thousands of truly terrible things occurring, injustices, violations of natural order, but equally there are countless thousands of profoundly net positive things occurring. If our focus is exclusively on the former, we inevitably begin to create our own hell and doom ourselves to unhappiness and discontent. It's become human nature to take things for granted, but if you're blessed with health, or a family member or two that loves and cares for you, or a good friend, or any occupation or pastime that brings a genuine smile to your face, gratitude for these things should be foremost in mind. If you can learn to cultivate this, I promise you'll be glad you did, for so many reasons, but especially for our demographic, as it helps offset the justified anger and balance out one's personality or character. And this type of balance is absolutely key, not just to manifest happiness or contentment, but to allow one to act more effectively in the world, with regard to motivation and drive and work ethic, and one's ability to function at their highest potential. Again, it may sound counterintuitive to some at first glance, but finding valid reasons to be grateful and thankful, be it to God, or those we love and care about, or fate itself, significantly improves a person on multiple fronts. I'm reminded of the quote, "Growth in wisdom can be measured by the decrease in bitterness," and in my experience, this is very true. Number 8. I'd love to see us move, in all respects, from the complex and Byzantine to the simple and straightforward, and to recognize that there is a unique power and purity in this simplicity, and that this power and purity is often synonymous with truth. We've become a society that all too often associates having a handle on the complexity of our age with intelligence or education, all the while failing to recognize, in my opinion, that learning the intricacies and minutiae of this or that given theory isn't just not a net positive, but can be a very real net negative if the foundational premise of said theory is incorrect or based on a misunderstanding. Critical race theory is just one great example of this, but there are countless more. Most of it boils down to the devoting of so many hours of precious time and energy to, quote, learn a series of things that are demonstrably false, or ideas or theories that represent political or ideological weapons. So much in this category isn't knowledge in any traditional sense of the word. It represents the wildly speculative stabs in the dark, the subjective opinion of a small group of men with sufficient chutzpah to sell their personal musings as factual realities. But I don't mean to reduce this concept to the merely political. In all things, an honest and straightforward simplicity will tend to serve us better in life. A big part of this is simply learning to pull back our own perspective, to attempt to always examine the broader picture. Getting lost in the weeds and missing the forest for the trees seems to be a leading reason that otherwise intelligent people fall into the adoption of truly ridiculous ideas. A focus on the details and specifics, while ignoring the faulty premise at the root of it all, represents such a waste of energy. The devil is in the details, so the saying goes, and complexity is so often a vehicle for hiding nefarious intent, or granting interpretive freedom and the power of wiggle room to the interpreter. And this segues nicely into the related number 9. I'd love to see us move away from an unconditional respect for or embrace of the intellect and toward wisdom and a fundamental understanding of the difference between the two. And I don't want to be misunderstood here. I do think the brain's raw computing power, or innate intellect, is certainly important and represents a valuable and worthwhile tool, especially when these gifts are exceptional. Yet more and more, we seem to equate intelligence with education, and because education is increasingly equivalent to indoctrination, we've slowly moved into this strange dynamic in which the most indoctrinated might easily be viewed as the most intelligent. In the circles of the ideological left, reading the New York Times, The Atlantic, The Economist is simply what intelligent people do, to refine and fill out their often pretentious intellects. What these publications represent, however, are, more often than not, equally pretentious and heavily politicized word salads, opinion pieces, often of the worst and most manipulative order, masquerading as helpful context and factual knowledge. Wisdom, by contrast, is something deeper and more profound. It represents a firmer grasp of the broader picture. It's more traditional in nature, generational, and time-tested, and often far better representative of the timeless truths that all who came before us considered most important to pass on. It's often born from life experience, as opposed to the dry and clinical scholarly musings one might hear recited in a nasal monotone by a university professor. And this nasal monotone isn't unimportant. When a person truly knows something of importance and value, truly and deeply understands it and grasps its significance, you won't hear them speak about it in the manner of a detached and disinterested individual who treats the recitation as a chore. Our existence isn't composed fundamentally of lifeless little factoids and trivia. It contains spirit, depth, substance, for those with eyes to see it and ears to hear it, to those intuitive enough to sense its reality or even viscerally feel its presence. Wisdom springs forth from these realms, whereas the modern intellectual is often a mere calculator or sophist. He can memorize an intriguing bit of trivia to impress peers at a cocktail party, or embrace and communicate a wild theory about race or gender, using suitably complex terminology and large and obscure words enough to impress his reader or listener. But that's precisely what all of this is: obscurantism, a facade, a front to hide hollowness, and a lack of this deeper wisdom. Growing up, I experienced my own phase of being enamored with the products of pure intellect, believing electrical signals in the brain represented the sum total of our reality and our interface with it. Life experience and some deeper intuitive realizations taught me that the oft-derided concepts of the heart or gut instinct are profoundly important, to the extent that all things merely intellectual now seem a bit ridiculous and superficial in comparison, far more prone to error and misstep, far more subject to disorientation or inaccuracy, springing from pretentiousness and ego, far more likely to sway with the prevailing winds of popular culture, no matter how absurd these may be. Intellect, to me, came to be seen a bit like that teacher's pet, know-it-all student, full of confident proclamations, because they'd just memorized a textbook they'd taken to be gospel truth, with wisdom, by comparison, being the quiet elder in the background, likely knowing this student better than they know themselves in many ways, fully conscious of the theory they're expounding, even the missteps that led them there, and patiently awaiting the day in which life experience and internal realizations will gently nudge them back on track. It is good to be intelligent. It's far better to be wise if you can swing it. I strongly believe this is the superior goal to strive for. And number 10, I'd love to see us gravitate from all things egotistical to all things modest. And I'd like to share what I believe is a unique take on the topic,
that I've not heard elsewhere. All of nature, all of the universe, innately seeks equilibrium and balance. When an individual touts themselves to others, attempts to communicate their merits and their greatness, and all the ways in which they believe themselves to be superior, the natural innate tendency of all around them is to check this runaway pride in the manner of checks and balances. And often, the natural tendency of the prideful is then to double down and provide justifications for the boasts. And the opposite is true for the person who is modest, humble, or self-effacing. The natural tendency is to lift these up and highlight their strengths to redress this balance.
I think it's important to clarify I'm absolutely not suggesting modesty as a, quote, strategy. This wouldn't be genuine modesty at all, but clever, calculating, manipulative behavior. I'm only suggesting that if you're able to find a very real and genuine reason to feel this modesty and humbleness, you'll find yourself spending far less time at war with the world, trying to prove yourself to others. For me, finding this genuine reason was easy. I try not to compare myself to the average, indoctrinated, and hopelessly lost man on the street, but instead to my ideal conception of the best and brightest examples of exceptional individuals from generations past. This makes it easy, even second nature, to feel modesty from a position of admiration and respect. If we compare ourselves to confused and indoctrinated NPC types in a fallen and chaotic era in which we've so lost the plot, it's easy to be carried away with feelings of superiority and self-importance. But we only do ourselves a disservice with these comparisons. It feels a bit like a man taking pride in beating up a girl, or being faster than an infant. Being better oriented than the average modern man on the street is a very low bar. If your focus is on the truly exceptional and meritorious, and if such men are your ever-present examples or role models, or standards of behavior, you'll not only improve yourself, but find yourself being shaped into a far less pretentious or insufferable human being in the process. And again, I feel I'm only using one fairly superficial example to scratch the surface of a much deeper point that deserves more elaborate discussion. But in summary, an egotistical nature will reduce your quality of life on virtually every front. It will repel good people and cause their opposites to gravitate your way. It'll lead you down paths of delusion and misapprehension, to blunder and embarrassment. Pride goeth before the fall is very much a truism, because it's not just people that act as the balance and equalizing force. It's nature herself on both the micro level of the individual and the macro level of the group or community. Nations or cultures that seek to war with nature inevitably pay a very real price, and of course inevitably lose the battle in the longer term. We are intended to flow with nature insofar as possible, and recognize it as a symbiotic, complementary force. Part of this, as individuals, is never consciously attempting to punch above our weight for selfish reasons. Take the animal kingdom, for an example, and picture great apes, or a group of lions, in which an untested and unready male somehow took charge simply out of lust or greed. His inability to feed or protect his group may well end up costing them everything. He's not innately wired to take up that responsibility. And in striving to unnaturally fill this role, he inevitably invites disaster. The animal kingdom is fantastic at preventing this, broadly speaking. We, however, have become far less so, in large part because we're now taught and conditioned from an early age to be ego-driven creatures. People now strive for power and influence as a default setting for its own sake, not so much to better the state of the world, but merely to enjoy the perceived rewards. The truly great geniuses throughout history, with few exceptions, never felt the need to sing their own praises. Their focus was on putting in the work. The rest was out of their control. And, I like to think, the rest often didn't matter much to them. This, I feel, is the ideal mindset, and it's the perspective echoed by both the greatest teachers and the greatest sages of prior ages. We have an element of the divine within us, powerful and potent and lofty, literally beyond words. Atop this, we tend to pile numerous badges and labels and superficial conceptions of, quote, self. It's precisely this superficial conception of self that Satanism essentially deifies and worships, the fraudulent detritus we accumulate and layer atop of our divine core. The more selfish a person is in this context, the more satanic, and the more one loses touch with the divine and everything higher. This self is a hodgepodge collection of the ephemeral, transitory, conditional, and fallible. When we worship it, we're worshiping the lesser, and we can't help but become the lesser for it. And on to number 11. I'd like to see us move from a passive approach to all happening around us to a much more proactive, thoughtful, considerate, and analytical, especially with regard to recognizing the power of our intuition and learning to hone it accordingly. It fascinates me just how different people are in this regard, and their abilities to read people. To those people especially bad at this, they tend to take in the words of other people almost as if they were reading a transcript from a piece of paper, and either ignore or disregard the plethora of other signals being broadcast. Those who have become especially good at this art, on the other hand, instinctively pay close attention to the mannerisms and body language, cadence and intonation of their speech, the specific word choices made to the detriment of others, where the emphasis is placed as they speak them. In other words, they're receiving a much more complete and comprehensive communication, and in fact, probably sensing a great many things that the speaker isn't consciously aware they're communicating. Developing these abilities to a high art is one of the closest things to a superpower, and perhaps even far more so when you regularly turn these powers of analysis on yourself, not just with regard to how you communicate, but how you think, why you think, what your motivations might be, what your deeper intentions might be. I tend to think most people hate to uncover errors or flaws or irrational biases in themselves, which can cause us to turn these abilities off when it comes to self-analysis. But of course, this is such a profound mistake. Coming to understand the self as fully as you're able is easily, by any measure, one of the most important tasks we have in life. After all, it's this self that we use to take in and process and interpret all of reality, every last thing that occurs around us. The more cleanly and accurately we can get a handle on this framework or vessel, and just what makes it tick, and how it ticks, the more cleanly and accurately we're able to understand anything and everything else. Picture Sherlock Holmes, to give some example of what's meant here, and the way he would attempt to comprehensively engage his detective personality and his analytical powers by watching things so closely and in a deeply considered and thoughtful way. A person's clothing may speak volumes, or how they carry themselves, or the specific type of mask they're attempting to put on for the sake of onlookers. His absolute mastery of the art was largely literary invention, of course, but there are people who can and do just this on a daily basis. And the only thing superior to be able to see into and through all of those around you is being able to turn this discerning eye on yourself and begin that almost alchemical process of burning off the detritus, your pretensions and foolish pride, your dishonesty or dissimulation, your self-justifications, your weaknesses and failings. Seek to cultivate this high art, and you won't regret doing so. It has the potential to save you a great deal of stress and heartache, and prevent many of the gravest missteps and misjudgments throughout life. And on to number 12. I'd like to see us move from the superficial to the fundamental, from a more surface layer understanding and approach to our existence to something deeper, especially with regard to personal growth and development. One of the greatest things to ever happen to me, ironically, was losing everything. Of course, it may not have felt so great at the time, but the ramifications and longer-term effects were so profoundly positive that I've become forever attached to the concept of materialistic minimalism and keeping all things at arm's length as a general rule. One of the elements I so appreciated about the process was when you lose all external trappings, all those badges and outward signals to the world that we use to communicate our wealth or our intellect or our educational attainments or occupational achievements, what you're left with is your internal wealth, all of what truly matters. Instead of cultivating the impression of this or that for the sake of those looking on, you're instead motivated to cultivate the real thing, lasting things that can't be taken away. Whether this be intellect or knowledge or wisdom, philosophical or spiritual orientation, or rewarding relationships, or genuinely fulfilling occupations. The importance of learning to cultivate substance over style could hardly be stressed enough. To give an example by way of analogy, imagine being one of those very sad souls who gets muscle implants to superficially improve their physique. And yes, sadly, this is an actual thing that seems to be happening more and more lately as mental disorder takes center stage. Imagine, then, having to actually use your physical strength in real-world conditions. Picture some emergency. It would, of course, fail you utterly, and should this happen in a public setting, you'd be embarrassed by it, completely defeating the egotistical purpose of these artificial helps in the first place. Moreover, most people would be able to tell at a glance that something was off about your body composition, especially those with a keen eye. You'd only be able to fool other, similar idiots. You'd gain none of the endorphins and boosted mood that workouts produce, none of the profound health benefits, none of the mental and psychological benefits from a regular workout routine. You'd gain nothing but some poor, faded copy and the simulacrum of the end results. And even this would require regular upkeep, medical procedures, and additional cost. Of course, this is a very niche and narrow example, I know, but it does help illustrate the point. Putting a great deal of time and energy exclusively into manifesting dishonest outward impressions, like a woman who wears a pound of makeup to conceal all flaws, is essentially deception, not only of others, but on some level of yourself. If similar energy was spent working on fundamentals, working on accruing the stuff that can't be lost or taken away, the benefits for both the individual and the group would be enormous. And finally, our final point for this specific cast, though I may pick up on this theme and continue the list in future episodes, number 13. I would so like to see us gravitate from nihilistic despair to a justified sense of hope. As just about anyone that has followed my content probably knows by now, one of my biggest frustrations with the state of our larger dissident circle is the amount of people who've wholly given themselves up to despair and hopelessness. Those who see only problems, never solutions, and genuinely seem to believe solutions to be impossibilities. We need to recognize the fact that we naturally move toward our dominant thought, and that our choice of perspective plays a massive role in our future. I think when I say this can sometimes be misunderstood to mean that I don't think a collapse is coming, or that significant violence and bloodshed is a very real possibility in the future. or that I think our current predicament might be solved politically or economically. I absolutely don't make any of these claims. When I urge people to reject the poisonous black pill, I'm suggesting that we recognize there may be very real hardships we'll be forced to wrestle with in coming years, but that ultimately, and that is the key word, something vastly better will rise out of this chaos. I have to admit I wasn't entirely comfortable with the promotion of films like The Joker by certain influential individuals in our broader community, and the embrace of the clown world conception of pure chaos and destruction, etc. I understand those who'd love nothing more than to see fires consume this mess that we've stumbled into, but there's a dangerous urge among many to become and personify this chaos, to only encourage this all-consuming fire, as opposed to cultivating some vision for what might be constructed in its place. Chaos and destruction isn't a winning strategy, for the simple fact that those with a plan always end up winning the day. Destruction is only the means of clearing the path, a first half of the battle. It's not an end in itself, and embracing this mentality all but guarantees a newer and slightly different manifestation of this same darkness will take the place of the old order, when the status quo truly does collapse. But of course, it's not just the embrace of chaos I'd like to speak to here, but the type of exhausted nihilism that embraces nothing, and doesn't even have the energy to destroy, let alone create. As Heraclitus said, and as history so clearly proves, quote, "If you do not have hope, you will not win that which is not hoped for, since it is unattainable and inaccessible." End quote. In a literal sense, hopelessness of this sort causes us to lack the contextual reference points to even allow for success or positive happenings on any front. Every single new happening or development comes to be seen through a negative lens, and this mentality makes success impossible, not just for the individuals holding the viewpoint, but in all they influence and infect with similar conceptions. It's the epitome of self-limiting, and the irony here is that it's completely inaccurate and wrong-headed. There are countless ways our present situation might eventually come to a positive resolution, and these countless ways only represent that small sliver of the readily conceivable, completely discounting those wildly exceptional twists of fate so common in history. In short, if we refuse to envision paths to victory, we're inevitably unable to follow any paths in the right direction, and defeat is guaranteed, because this initial vision or conception is the prerequisite of all that follows. Demoralization is a weapon. It might even be argued that it's the single most potent weapon employed as a means of psychological warfare. The powerful parties truly running the show paint themselves as invincible and unassailable in an effort to become invincible and unassailable. In reality, they represent an extremely small minority who've simply created a clever structure to disempower us and tie us in knots. But should their precise means and methods ever be fully exposed and understood by a critical mass or a sufficient number, their weapons would immediately cease to have bite, and this dominance ends immediately. The question is not if this dark cloud will someday be lifted, but only when and how. If you find yourself hopelessly nihilistic and pessimistic, I suggest continuing to pull back your perspective until you're able to shake this. Meaning, instead of looking at the next few months or years, look at the next decade or two, centuries if you have to. And if you're the most black-pilled and hopeless individual alive, consider planetary or cosmic cycles of death, rebirth, destruction, and creation. No believers in a higher power should ever get to this point. Those of us that truly recognize the Creator's hand in the universe also recognize that all is in these hands, and that, ultimately, the universe naturally gravitates towards healthy balance
equilibrium, and encourages life and creation. And all of us play some role, however minuscule or outsized, in altering this fabric of time and space. When you exclusively focus on and spread this darkness, you're having a net negative effect. I strongly believe the goal should be to find the most positive, truthful perspective, or the most truthful, positive perspective, and orient yourself accordingly. Banish the darkness. It's not worthy of your attention. It accomplishes nothing and only serves to drag you downward. And that's all for now. I hope you're all well, and thank you for listening.
This is the end, beautiful friend. This is the end, my own.